stop for a second. This video is not about nostalgia. It's about a quiet psychological advantage hiding in plain sight. If you grew up before social media, something rewired your brain in ways science is only now catching up to. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. So stay with me, because by the end of this story, you'll recognize yourself and everyone else very differently. And if you want more deep dives like this, hit subscribe now. Before the secret slips past you, there's a reason people who grew up before constant screens seem oddly calm, unshakable, even amused by modern chaos. It isn't arrogance, it's pattern recognition. You were shaped in an environment that no longer exists. A psychological gap formed there. And that gap became power. This sits squarely in hidden psychological territory, because most people feel the effects without ever knowing the cause. The first trait begins with something that sounds almost cruel by today's standards. Being left alone, not neglected, trusted to figure things out without a tutorial, a notification, or an adult hovering nearby. Here's the tension. When boredom arrived, there was no escape hatch, no algorithm, no instant dopamine. Boredom stayed. It pressed on you, and eventually, it forced a decision. Create, explore, build, or endure the discomfort. That moment rewired your executive function. Research on unstructured childhood environments shows that when kids generate their own stimulation, the brain strengthens planning, impulse control, and creative problem solving. But that's just the surface. What really formed was identity. You didn't just do things. You decided who you were when no one was watching. That's why people from this era often trust their own judgment more than external validation. You learned early that silence wasn't dangerous. Emptiness wasn't failure. It was space, and space became possibility. But here's the twist. That independence didn't make you reckless. It made you precise, which leads to the second hidden trait quietly running your nervous system today. Adaptive risk calibration. You didn't learn fear from headlines or comment sections. You learned it from gravity, speed, and consequence. You climbed higher than you should have. You fell. You got back up. Each mistake taught your body where the real edge actually was. Developmental psychology shows that physical risk and play trains the brain to distinguish true danger from manageable uncertainty. That's why, decades later, your baseline anxiety is lower. Your system has data, not opinions. ... This is why you can walk into disorder and immediately start organizing it. While others freeze or you prioritize, you act. Your brain remembers surviving real stakes, not simulated ones. And here's where the tension tightens. Because this advantage came with a cost. You were never taught to talk about it. You just assumed everyone else had it too. They don't. And that misunderstanding is creating a silent divide between generations right now. One group feels overwhelmed. The other feels confused by the overwhelm. And we haven't even reached the most misunderstood trait yet. The one that explains why you process emotions, authority, and meaning so differently today. That's where this story gets uncomfortable. And it's not the trait people usually praise. It isn't toughness or resilience. It's something quieter, almost invisible. A mental filter that decides what deserves your attention and what doesn't. This filter was forged before likes could vote on your worth, before outrage became currency, before identity was performed instead of discovered, and it explains why you can sit alone with your thoughts without panicking, while others reach for noise like oxygen. But this filter also makes you dangerous to manipulate. You don't respond the way systems expect you to. Fear campaigns bounce off, trends feel hollow. Authority has to earn respect. That creates friction, especially in a world built on constant reaction. In the next part, we're going to expose this final hidden psychological trait, why it scares institutions, and why once you recognize it, you'll never see modern culture the same way again. That revelation will challenge everything you think you know about strength, freedom, and control. And it starts by questioning a belief you've carried for decades, without realizing where it came from. Here's the uncomfortable truth most people never articulate. If you grew up before social media, you developed a psychological immunity that today's world quietly struggles to control. And it didn't come from rebellion. It came from something far more threatening to modern systems. Internal validation. Let's start with a question that sounds simple but isn't. Who told you who you were growing up? Not your peers. Not strangers. Not an algorithm. You discovered yourself in private moments. Alone in your room, on long bike rides, in half-finished projects no one ever applauded. That formed the third hidden psychological trait, an internally anchored identity. In hidden psychological research, this matters more than intelligence or confidence. Studies show that people who form identity through self-referenced feedback, instead of constant social comparison, are dramatically less susceptible to external manipulation. Praise doesn't inflate them. Criticism doesn't shatter them. They listen, assess, and decide. That's why compliments sometimes make you uncomfortable, and insults feel oddly hollow. But here's the tension. This trait makes modern life feel awesome. You can sense when something is performative, when outrage is manufactured, when attention is being farmed instead of earned. You don't instinctively join the pot. You pause. And pausing, today, is treated like disobedience. This is why people who grew up before social media are often labeled out of touch, emotionally reserved, or detached. But that's a misdiagnosis. You're not detached. You're anchored. You don't need constant affirmation to exist. And in a culture built on reaction, that makes you unpredictable. Now let's connect the final dots. Remember that early freedom mixed with responsibility? That combination forged something rare. Emotional self. You weren't rescued from every feeling. You weren't shielded from disappointment. You felt boredom, frustration, loneliness, and confusion fully. And because no one rushed in to fix it, your nervous system learned something critical. Feelings pass. Modern psychology confirms this. Children allowed to experience and resolve emotional discomfort independently develop stronger emotional resilience as adults. That's why you don't panic when things feel heavy. You've been there before. You know it ends. But here's the twist nobody talks about. This strength can feel like isolation. Because when you don't outsource your emotions, people don't always know how to relate to you. You're calm when others want drama. You're quiet when others want noise. And that can make you feel invisible. Yet invisibility is exactly where your power lives. You don't need to announce your values. You live them. You don't need to perform outrage. You act when it matters. You don't need permission to think. And that final trait ties everything together. Psychological sovereignty. The ability to govern your inner world without constant external input. This is why people often come to you in crises. Not because you have all the answers, but because your presence slows the room down. Your nervous system communicates safety without saying a word. That trait was forged before constant connectivity trained people to outsource calm. And now, here's the final revelation. The world is quietly rediscovering the very traits it tried to replace. Focus, independence, emotional regulation, real creativity. And people are searching for them everywhere, except where they originally came from. The generation that grew up before social media isn't outdated. It's unfinished business. Proof that humans function differently when attention isn't constantly harvested, when boredom is allowed, when mistakes are survived instead of archived, when identity is built privately before it's shared publicly. And here's the most powerful part. These traits aren't gone. They're transferable. Once you recognize them, you can deliberately train them again. In yourself, in your kids, in your environment, by reintroducing silence, risk, unstructured time, and emotional patience. That's why this matters. Not to romanticize the past, but to reclaim what worked, because the future won't belong to the loudest voices. It will belong to the calmest minds. And now that you see it, the question becomes uncomfortable. What would happen if more people stopped reacting and started remembering who they were before the noise?